we are in the fight of our lives, and we are losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. Global temperatures keep rising. And our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. Humanity has a choice: cooperate or perish. It is either a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact.
Existen muchos científicos de renombre mundial en un amplio espectro de las disciplinas de la ciencia que se han dedicado a la investigación para el entendimiento del clima y sus cambios. Sin embargo, son muy pocos los que lo han enfocado desde una perspectiva más amplia en el intento por comprender integralmente un fenómeno caótico como es el clima, complementando la física y las matemáticas con otras dimensiones del conocimiento y de las ciencias, como la economía, la demografía, la sociología, la política y la historia. Uno de ellos es la persona que oirán a continuación y que merece ser presentado de una manera más especial. Él es un orador de la talla y genialidad de Sir Winston Churchill, que puede hacer reír a carcajadas al público para conmoverlo hasta las lágrimas un instante después, siempre usando la tradicional flema y fino sentido del humor británicos, pero sin nunca dejar de lado su potente mensaje. Ex asesor en políticas públicas de la primera ministra Margaret Thatcher, él es uno de los más importantes investigadores y promotores de la verdad sobre el cambio climático del mundo. Ha dado conferencias en la mayoría de los países desarrollados de Occidente y asesoró al equipo de transición del presidente Donald Trump, influyendo decisivamente en él de retirarse del Acuerdo de París. Me refiero a Lord Christopher Monckton, tercer vizconde de Brenchley, quien amablemente ha aceptado hacer esta entrevista cátedra. El punto único que hará Lord Monckton en esta presentación es que es posible combinar los resultados de la ciencia climática dominante sin criticarlos ni tratar de demostrar que son erróneos con métodos de la economía convencional para llevar a cabo el primer análisis de costo-beneficio creíble sobre cero neto global al 2050. Y los resultados son sorprendentes, pero confiables. En el Global Investment in Sustainable Development CC Forum de Londres, Lord Monckton hizo recientemente esta misma presentación ante gestores de fondos de cobertura e inversores destacados que quedaron asombrados y también fascinados porque pudieron seguir cada paso de su sencillo pero muy poderoso argumento que ahora verán. Estimado Lord Monckton, bienvenido a Chile y estoy convencido que muchos países de Iberoamérica y desde luego el mundo angloparlante quedarán asombrados con sus palabras. El micrófono y las cámaras son todos suyos.
Well, Douglas, hola to everybody in the Spanish-speaking world. Forgive me for speaking in English. I hope that they will be able to translate some of what I say into your own language, but it is a real pleasure to accept Douglas Pollock's very kind invitation to speak to you all at this moment. Now, the reason why Douglas asked me to talk to you is that I showed him a single sheet of paper from the Strategic Threat Assessment Group, which examines for the governments of the NATO countries the various threats that might make life difficult for the democracies of the world. And one of the matters that the group has been looking at is the question of whether climate change or policies intended to address climate change would be the bigger risk. Now, this is the kind of question that does have to be asked, unfortunately. It's not just a question of saying climate change will destroy us all unless we close down all the Western economies. We have to take a more careful and properly calculated approach. And that's what I'm going to do. And in the first slide, please, I'm going to show you the graph, which is an official graph from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and it maintains what it calls the Annual Greenhouse Gas Index. And this index shows the total combined effect of all the greenhouse gases that we emit all around the world on climate. And the units are watts per square meter, but we'll just call them units for simplicity. And as you can see, the total combined effect over the last 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, we just take that 30-year period, is a continuing increase in a more or less perfect straight line, amounting to 1 unit over 30 years, more or less exactly 1/30th of a unit of man-made influence on climate over a year. And as you will see, CO2 is the biggest growth factor here. All the others have not really changed very much. You'll see in particular methane. And as you know, down in Latin America, you have many countries, one thinks chiefly of Argentina, which have a large beef farming industry. And we're being told we shouldn't eat meat anymore to save the planet. Well, not only is that scientifically wrong, it's also very clear that the methane that is emitted has hardly changed throughout the last 30 years. So that's an important point. We do not need to destroy the beef farming or dairy farming industries. In fact, the biggest source of methane biogenically, that means from the animal kingdom, is from termite ants. It's not from beef at all. So if they were going to have a campaign against termite ants, that might make a difference. But doing anything about agriculture will not make any difference to the methane levels. But we're looking here at the overall increase in a straight line over the past 30 years. And now we've got to look, we're going to examine in this little presentation what would happen if the whole world actually decided to go from where we were in 2020 in a straight line by steady reduction of its emissions of greenhouse gases to net zero emissions by 2050. Now, because we cannot reverse the CO2 or other gases already put in the atmosphere, they will work their way out of it in their own time. All that we can do is prevent the next unit if we were to go immediately down to zero emissions in 2020, which we didn't do. But let's suppose we move in a straight line from 2020 to 2050 over the next 30 years, then that would mean that we would abate or reduce or prevent half of the next unit that would otherwise have occurred over the next 30 years. So that's if we all went to net zero. The best we could achieve is a reduction of half a unit of our influence on climate via the greenhouse gases. Now we're going to do a calculation on the back of an envelope. That's a phrase we use in English to say a first order or simple calculation. But just because the calculation you're going to see is simple doesn't mean it isn't also correct. It is a correct calculation. So on the next slide, please, we're going to see the back of an envelope. And as you will see, the 30 years human influence that we would add over the next 30 years is 1 unit. But if we all go in a straight line from 2020 to global net zero by 2050, slowly reducing that, then the most we can prevent is half of the next unit. So we put that on the back of our envelope. And so you can see how very simple, but also how very robust and straightforward this calculation is. And it's important to note that the NOAA data, they are the official data for our effect on the climate. That's the data that everybody uses. So we're not advancing any complicated theories or unusual data. All of it is mainstream data, mainstream methods, and mainstream conclusions from that. So on the next slide, please, we're going to see how much warming would be prevented by each unit of the effect on climate that we might otherwise have had that we would not have if we go to net zero. And we go to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the official body that studies the question of the climate. And there we see, taking mid-range estimates, we're not going to push them in one direction or another, we just use their middle-of-the-road estimates. And what we see is that if you take doubled CO2 concentration, just as an example, then we can see they are predicting at mid-range 3 Celsius of warming, and that represents about 4 units of our influence on climate. So that means each unit causes 3/4 of a Celsius degree, either of warming if we add it, or of abatement of temperature if we take it away. So at 3/4 of a unit per Celsius degree changed, if we now go to the next slide, which shows the back of our envelope again, what you will see now is that we multiply the half unit that we, if the whole world went to net zero, would be able to prevent over the next 30 years by 3/4 of a Celsius degree per unit. It's a simple multiplication sum. You can do this on a pocket calculator very easily, and that means you get 0.375 Celsius. Really straightforward. That is the final warming prevented, even if the whole world went to global net zero. It's 3/8 of a Celsius degree. It's less than half a Celsius degree in the next 30 years. That is assuming that the IPCC's figures are correct and assuming that the NOAA's figures are correct. These are their figures. All we're doing is a very straightforward back of the envelope calculation. So now we move on. We want to know what this is going to cost. So we go to the next slide, and what that shows is that McKinsey and Company have done the work for us. They are the world's leading consultancy. Again, we're using mainstream data here. And like so many of these consultancies, they make their money by going along with whatever the establishment opinion is at the time. And the establishment opinion at the moment is that climate change is all terrible and we have to do something about it. And here they have made what is very probably an extremely conservative estimate of what it would cost the world just in capital expenditure alone to go to net zero. And it would be $275,000 billion. That's $275 trillion. And that would amount to half of all the profits of all the companies around the world over the next 30 years, 1/4 of all tax revenue, and about a 1/14 of all household spending. So very, very serious money indeed, but that's just the capital expenditure. Now, normally, as you would know, you have to multiply the capital expenditure by at least 3 to get the total expenditure, which will include what's known as the operating expenditure, or OPEX. So you have CAPEX and OPEX. So if we go to the next slide, there you will see again, where we've now filled up the back of our envelope because our calculation is complete. And what it shows is that the cost of getting to net zero would be $275,000 billion in capital expenditure, and that's McKinsey's figure. We then add about double that for operating expenditure, and that gives you about $800,000 billion, $800 trillion just in the next 30 years to get to net zero. Now, if we divide the final warming prevented by that global net zero by the cost of 800,000 billion, then each billion spent on trying to prevent that warming will only prevent 1/2 millionth of a Celsius degree. And this is a straightforward arithmetical calculation. We're not doing anything complicated. We're not doing anything dishonest. I've showed you the 3 sources of evidence. You can see them in orange there on the slide. NOAA for our influence on the climate over 30 years. The IPCC's estimate of per unit. Then we've got the cost of going to net zero. And that gives you this extraordinary, very powerful, but very simple result. That even if the even if we spent $1 billion, every $1 billion we spent on trying to make global warming go away by going to net zero, will only abate 1/2 millionth of a Celsius degree. Now, in the real world, were we not in this very strange debate about climate, we would take a look at those figures and decide that there's really nothing we can do about this. You can see you get hardly any change in global temperature. You spend enormous amounts of money, and the value for money, which is that bottom line there, is very, very, very poor. It's so poor as to be insignificant. It really isn't worth doing at all. But unfortunately, this is a wildly optimistic picture. And I'm going to show you why, starting with the next slide. And here we go back to the IPCC, because you see the IPCC's central estimate of 3/4 of a Celsius degree per unit of our influence by greenhouse gases on the climate is proving to have been incorrect, because that's the same sort of prediction as they made in 1990. But they also made predictions of how much global warming would have occurred by now as a result of our influence on climate. And they predicted, as you see here, it's rather complicated to work it out because they do not state this in a simple form. But if we do the sums, they predicted in 1990 that the medium-term warming, starting for some reason in 1850, 140 years before their prediction, then they say that by 2030, there would have been a total of 1.8 Celsius of global warming, of which almost half a Celsius had already occurred by 1990. So you subtract that off, and they're predicting really that there would be about 1 1/3 Celsius degrees of warming over the 40 years from 1990 to 2030. That's a period of 4 decades. So that means that they're predicting about 1/3 of a Celsius degree of warming per decade should have happened between 1990 and now. So now what we're going to see on the next slide is how much there's actually been. And it wasn't 0.34, it was only 0.14. How do we know? Because the satellites, which are the most accurate way of measuring changes in global temperature, these satellites are from the University of Alabama at Huntsville. And these satellites were designed and built by, and now are operated by, the people who produce the data set from them. That's why this is the best of all the temperature data sets. And Dr. John Christie and Dr. Roy Spencer, two of the most formidable scientists there have ever been, they very ingeniously designed these satellites. They run this data set. And this, up to the most recent month, shows that the averaged rate of warming per decade is 0.14 Celsius per decade and not 0.34. Now, this extraordinary fact is something you will not have seen reported in any mainstream news medium. They say it's all far worse than we expected. Well, no, it isn't. If you think that warmer weather is a bad thing, then it's far better than we expected. But of course, that doesn't fit the narrative, so they don't tell you the truth. But there is the figure. So now we go back to our back of the envelope calculation. We have to correct it, because that 3/4 of a Celsius per unit was obviously an exaggeration. So we must multiply it by what I call the reality ratio, the ratio of observed warming from the University of Alabama at Huntsville to the predicted warming per decade that the IPCC itself has made. And that means we have to multiply that 0.75 by that ratio, which is 0.41, and you get the answer. The final warming prevented by global net zero will not be, as we thought it was, 0.375 Celsius, about 3/8 of a Celsius degree. It will only be 0.15 Celsius degree, which is somewhere between 1/6 and 1/7 of a Celsius degree. Again, this is a tiny fraction. Remember, this is if the whole world goes to net zero, you get practically nothing in return for all that expenditure. And so that means instead of 1/2 millionth of a Celsius degree for every $1 billion spent on trying to make global warming go away, in fact, It's $1 billion will only buy you 1/5 millionth of a Celsius degree, a really, really tiny result. But I'm afraid even that is an optimistic picture. And if we go to the next slide, we will see that something is happening which, again, is not really being reported as widely as it should. That after all these 30 conferences, very nearly, that they've held on the climate internationally, consumption of coal and gas and oil, which the enemies of the West describe as fossil fuels, these are the fuels that built the great civilizations and the great economic developments of the last 150 years, all these are increasing. This is since the year 2000, and you can see they've been increasing quite rapidly with a dip for the pandemic, you can see towards the right-hand end. And this, again, these are official figures, this time from British Petroleum, one of the largest oil companies in the world. And they're saying, look, all these things are going up. They're not going down, they're going up. Now, why is this? Well, of course, the reason is that most of the world, in fact, about 70% of it, is not obliged under the Paris and related treaties to make any reductions in the emissions they make at all, because they count as developing countries. And these developing countries, amusingly, include India and China and occupied Tibet. Let's not forget that China is an imperialistic nation. It illegally occupies the fragrant theocratic kingdom of Tibet, and it's time they got out of there and left it to the Tibetans, but there it is. And India and China, they are the two reasons why this is just coal consumption we're looking at now on this slide. You can see coal consumption by region, huge increases in that region and the decline in the rest of the world. But China is going to build another 43 coal-fired power stations. India is going to do much the same. We're not going to see any reductions. Nobody except the stupid West is moving towards net zero at all. So all that we're doing is making it prohibitively expensive to do business in the West, which means that all the big businesses in steel and heavy manufacturing and motor manufacturing, they're all moving out of Britain and Europe and the United States and moving to India and China, not least because energy is now 1/10 of the price in China that it is, let us say, in Britain. And how can heavy industries that depend heavily on energy, the energy intensive industries as they're called, how can they possibly compete if the British and other Western governments are busy making electricity so expensive that virtually nobody who's running any kind of a manufacturing business can afford to turn on their machines? So we can see, therefore, that we're not actually going to get to net zero by 2050 anyway. And you can see here, this is the confirmation of the point I touched on earlier. This is the next slide, please. You will see that the primary energy growth, who is using more energy, 70% of it in 2018, which is a good recent year, is in nations wholly exempt from the Paris Treaty obligations to cut their emissions. And it's the West, basically, that accounts for just about all of the remaining 30%. So if we go to the next slide, what we see is that we're not going to be able to achieve the IPCC figures in red, that's the right-hand side there, because they got their sums wrong. They over-predicted warming. We have to correct it and use the green ones, but then we see we have to cross out the top line because there's no way the whole world is going to net zero. All the developing countries are just not doing it at all. We then go down to, all right, suppose the whole of the West went to net zero. Well, then maybe we would reduce the, the total abatement by about 1/3. So we would only get 0.05 instead of 0.15 degree if the whole of the West went to net zero, but we can't. And one of the reasons why we can't is that if the wind drops and the sun goes down, then wind power and solar power stop working. and you have to have some other way of generating electricity. And that means thermal power. All right, you get a little bit from hydro, you get a little bit from nuclear, but all the rest is going to have to come, like it or not, from coal and oil and gas, or otherwise the lights are going to go out. So that brings down the realistic warming that we might abate worldwide, because it's only the West that's going to do this, and only the West is going to be able to abate a little bit. It's going to be about 1/50th of a Celsius degree by 2050. That is the total difference to global temperature that we are buying with the hundreds of trillions the West is spending on bankrupting itself, throwing its workers out of jobs, and sending those jobs to the dictatorship of China, which is the most favored destination now to get manufacturing done. So this shows that there is no way that the West on its own can do anything much about global warming. And even if the whole world tried to do so, it would make no real discernible difference to the climate whatsoever. And of course, one should also mention in passing that warmer weather is better for life on Earth than colder weather. And a recent paper in The Lancet, which has been until now a cheerleader for the global warming nonsense, they're now beginning to say, well, actually, you're 10 times more likely to die of cold in all regions of the world on average than you are to die from heat. And in fact, in Africa, which is very interesting, you're 40 times more likely to die of cold than of heat, because it's cold, not heat, that is the big killer. And therefore, a little bit of global warming would be a very good thing, even for polar bears, as it turns out. But this is the bottom line here, is that we cannot abate over the next 30 years, however hard we try in the West, more than about 1/50th of a Celsius degree of global warming. And you've seen exactly how these numbers are calculated. That is the end of the presentation. The bottom line, as I've said, is that we can make very little difference to the climate. But there's one point that I think I should add, which has not yet been properly nailed down. But the Strategic Threat Assessment Group is now in talks with the ranking experts on what is called geometallurgy. Now, if you've never heard of geometallurgy, I shouldn't be surprised. But what it concerns itself with is the resources of the metals, particularly, that the world is going to need. Now, until now, very nearly all of the metal that we dig out of the ground is iron, which is turned into steel for manufacturing. Nearly all of it. But if you want to go to net zero, then, for instance, you can't make batteries for your electric car out of iron and steel because they'd weigh too much. You have to make them out of lithium. Now, lithium is known as a rare earth metal. There's actually quite a lot of it around. But to find deposits which are workable and where you can get a reasonable quantity out at a reasonable price is nothing like so easy. At the moment, China dominates the market in lithium. But that is one of many techno-metals, as they're now called. And these techno-metals are very expensive, and there is a terrible shortage of them. To give you some idea, if the former British Prime Minister's policy of replacing all new cars sold in the United Kingdom by 2030 with electric buggies were to come about, it won't, of course, because it isn't realistic, then 3/4 of the world's current total output of lithium carbonate and lithium hydroxide would be consumed just in Britain alone. And if you look at all the other metals, you need copper, for instance, which is now becoming very scarce, and that its price is going to shoot up in the next 10 or 15 years. Cobalt, neodymium, praseodymium, all these rare earth metals, as well as the heavier ones like copper, these are going to become very, very scarce, very, very much sought after. And the big problem is there isn't enough of them anyway, even to get to the first generation of the electrical replacement for coal and oil and gas. Even the first generation. And these generations, remember, they're not like a coal-fired power station that goes on for 50 or 60 years. We're talking of more like 10 to 15 years before, you know this with your mobile phone. The battery is one of the most fancy, swank lithium-ion batteries you can get. And after about 5 years, it's already lost half its capacity to hold a charge. And by 10 years, you've pretty much got to throw it away. So every 10 years, we're going to have to replace all of the various bits and pieces, the windmills, the solar farms. None of them last more than 10, 15, maximum 20 years. And the batteries still, yes. And you have to have battery backup, because if you're not going to have any coal and oil and gas, and you've only got a little bit of nuclear, you're going to have batteries to back up the entire global electricity grid. Now, you can imagine how many dozens of terawatt hours you're going to need to have in backup, and the enormous amount of resources that will take up. And so far, nobody has sat down and said, all right, even if we could do this, how much is it going to cost? Which of these metals will simply run out so that we can't do it anymore? And this is a huge problem which so far the world has not addressed. And I'm going to conclude just by saying this, that it's really important to understand that in this presentation that I have given you here, there is nothing but mainstream, mid-range, official science and economics. I am not advancing any theory. I am not saying the IPCC is wrong, except where I can show that the rate of warming that has occurred is only a tiny fraction of what they predicted 32 years ago. We've now been running their experiment for 32 years. They were wrong, but they have not altered their predictions. But even if you stick with their original predictions, all that you buy in global warming prevented is 1/50th of a Celsius degree over the next 30 years. And the cost per $1 billion spent on doing that is you only buy 1/2 millionth at best, more realistically, 1/5 millionth of a Celsius degree abated for each $1 billion spent. This is the economics of the lunatic asylum. And I thought it was very important that you in the Spanish-speaking world should be given some understanding of this. And so very kindly, Douglas is going to translate what I have said to you. He's going to translate my slides. And this presentation will come to you in your own language. And I shall also be doing this eventually in other languages too. But you are the first to get this, even before the English-speaking world has had this. You in the Spanish-speaking world, thanks to Douglas Pollock's intervention, are going to get this news first. And here is what I want you to do. I want you to look at the link to this video, where you will see there's a link to a one-page document, just 2 sides of a single A4 sheet, in which these calculations are set out in a convenient form that you can send to your politicians and ask them to check whether the Strategic Threat Assessment Group has got this right or wrong. You will find that it has got this right. Then you must ask your politicians, why are they continuing to spend any money at all on trying to make global warming go away when it's happening at only 40% of the originally predicted rate, and when warmer weather is better for life on Earth than colder weather and not the other way around? Ask them these simple, realistic questions, and then watch them wriggle. Because in various countries now, there are movements to set up political parties to say we will have nothing to do with this climate change narrative anymore. It is clearly targeted at the West and only at the West. There are agents of foreign powers paying for the various environmental front groups, which are all communist-led, Greenpeace being a very good example, that are campaigning to shut down the economies of the West. If the West is to survive and prosper at all, its politicians must wake up to what is being done to them. And the best way to do that is just to start looking at the very straightforward calculations that I have presented to you today. God bless you, and thank you for listening.
Okay, Christopher, it's a wonderful presentation, couldn't be stronger and powerful. Incredible what we just saw. And we will distribute it among Spanish-speaking countries, the most as we can. Now, what else could be added to this kind of presentation? There's nothing more to see, nothing more to look for. It's all here. This is the end of the game. Game over.
I think that's right. I think this actually is game over. I did present these results to a meeting of hedge fund managers and leading high net worth investors and also government representatives in London at the Dorchester Hotel, which is one of London's smartest hotels, just a couple of weeks ago. And interestingly, the climate change minister of the current, alas, collapsing Conservative government, when he heard that I and my good friend Mark Morano from the United States were going to be present and were going to give these results, he decided that, having originally accepted the invitation to attend himself, he would no longer appear. So you can see now that politicians are frightened of this result, because these are very simple calculations that they could and should have done, or the civil servants advising them could and should have done, but they didn't. Such is the intense pressure from environmental lobby groups, largely run by communists, largely paid for by Moscow and more recently by Peking, because they want to take over what is known in politics as the hegemony. It's the Greek word for leadership of the world. The West has been the leader of the world for perhaps 100, 200 years. Now, as a direct result, and really as the sole result of climate policy, we are destroying the West's leadership of the world, and we're passing it not to merrier, more democratic, freer countries elsewhere, but to the grim dictatorships of colonialist Russia and colonialist China. And Russia is now invading the Ukraine. China has already invaded Tibet, is now going to invade Taiwan. And the West is now too weak to stop them. And one of the reasons why it's too weak is that their agents of influence have sedulously pursued this climate nonsense for getting on for half a century. And the politicians have been so frightened of the damage to their reputations that would arise if they dared to speak out the truth, that they have fallen silent. And calculations such as that which I have just put before you are simply not being done. Well, now they are being done by the Strategic Threat Assessment Group, which has considerable influence over governments. We convey accurate information which they can verify because we say where we got it from and we show you exactly how we process it. Everything is explicit. Everything, you can see what we are doing. Nothing is hidden. And therefore, this is not secret. It's not kind of confidential. It's just very, very straightforward, using publicly available data and using simple arithmetic, which even a politician can probably understand. And that's why we want you to download this one sheet of paper. And on two sides of that sheet, you will find all these slides and all the text that accompanies them, explaining everything in a very concise and very short form. Circulate it widely. A version has been produced again by the kind offices of Douglas Pollock in Spanish, so it's going to be in your language. So please get copies of it and let your politicians know. And all you have to do is ask them one question. If this is not correct, where do you and your advisors say the Strategic Threat Assessment Group has got it wrong? It's as simple a question as that.
Okay, Christopher. Amazing. And we will do that. We will distribute it and get in touch with our congressmen and women for them to know all this. Thank you very much. And hopefully a whole continent will be grateful for your powerful presentation. We're looking forward for that.
Well, thank you, Douglas. God bless you all. And let us hope that common sense prevails before the Western world, the free world, commits economic harakiri.
Okay, let's hope so. Okay, Christopher, thank you very much again, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, thank you.
In addition, we're making the biggest investment ever to deal with the climate crisis. I know you all know there's no climate problem. I know you know that. So I spent a lot of time in Arizona, New Mexico, California, all through, flew up and down the state with your governor and those wildfires. I know they just happen.